If you look at legacy sequels as a whole, the most unifying thread is that of reverence to the source material and its legacy. In last summer's Alien Romulus, in a pivotal moment, David Johnson's Andy says,
"Get away from her. You bitch."
in direct reference to one of Ripley's most iconic lines in Aliens.
Get away from her, you bitch!
The crowd goes wild, recognizing a fabled line of dialogue they love from the storied franchise they grew up with, and that's understandable. The problem, however, is that it makes no fucking sense. I repeat, no fucking sense. Now, this may seem harsh, but if you watch that video that I did on Alien Romulus, you'll see my larger argument re franchise retreads. You may not agree in this particular instance, but you'd be hard-pressed to deny that if we're going to revisit beloved properties, we should probably do it for a reason that goes beyond a studio's bottom line. From a standpoint of fandom and lizard brain recognition, Andy's line is a crowd pleaser. From a standpoint of fidelity to its world, it's idiotic. Andy has not seen Aliens, and there's no logical reason for him to say that outside of Disney's mandate to massage a property for a younger audience while bringing in the old heads. It's the kind of surface pleasure that feels good in the moment, but ultimately cheapens the work itself. If the best thing you can say about a legacy sequel is that it reminds you of the original, chances are, the next time you sit down to revisit, you're much more likely to watch the original because the sequel's value is no more than its ability to evoke that which has come before, and better. If you're going to revisit history, why not rewrite it? When you think of Ridley Scott, you think of his career of heavy hitters: Alien, Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise, Black Hawk Down. It's easy to forget that he's also made some absolute wacko classics like Legend, Hannibal. Then there's The Counselor, but you know, you get the picture. He made household titles, and he made curveballs, and he often made them back to back. His career has been categorized by a multiplicity of perspectives on filmmaking in the world and a seeming refusal to repeat himself without some level of fundamental reinvention. His larger approach to storytelling was brought into sharp relief by one of his most recent and deeply underrated films, The Last Duel. The Last Duel could have been a relatively conventional medieval tale, and you'd be forgiven for presuming as much from the initial marketing. But the Rashomon approach to telling the same story from three distinct perspectives to reveal a rich thematic subjectivity is sort of the Rosetta Stone for interpreting Ridley's career and fascinations. The subject matter is historical, but the approach is uniquely postmodern. For many filmmakers, successive projects feel like hearing a new story from a recognized voice. For Ridley, every story is a rewriting of the past. Enter Gladiator II, an incredibly exciting project for Scott given the first film's intersection of audience love and Academy admiration. You could argue that at the time of its release, it was his most defining project. Sure, a gradual historical revision would suggest perhaps Alien or Blade Runner carry the mantle, but the truth is that those films have grown in stature and eventually came to represent pillars of science fiction, but at the time of their release, they suffered a mix of critical and commercial failure. In that way, Ridley Scott has often been ahead of his time. But with Gladiator, it was the right project at the right time, and it caught fire. It made stupid money, won awards, and sold millions of DVDs, but its ultimate commerciality was somewhat at odds with Ridley Scott's tendencies as a provocateur. As we've seen with his return to the Alien franchise, he's not interested in playing the hits. He has a specific vision rife with lore and myth-making that run purely contrary to the elemental isolation of the original. In some ways, it's as if he's responding to the ballooning franchise with his own expansive take on what a true sequel or prequel to Alien should be. With Gladiator II, he's after a similarly subversive idea. As a filmmaker, Scott has always been fascinated by history, not just the events themselves, but the way history is told, manipulated, and mythologized. His historical epics are less concerned with strict accuracy and more interested in the power of narrative and its ability to shape perception across time. Many were thrown by the comedic undertones of Napoleon and the way the titular figure was represented as a sort of self-styled cuck in a strange marital dynamic throwing childish tantrums. It flew in the face of the pristine and stately approach often taken with historical material. material, but its petulant human quality feels, in many ways, more true to life than history as it's often told. Similarly, audiences balked at the silly performances and wrought drama of House of Gucci, but the heightened aesthetic was arguably deployed as a commentary on the absurdity of celebrity and brand recognition as it dovetails with Dynasty. Whether you like the movie or not, and for the record, I'm not the biggest fan of that film, but you have to admit, it's not a haphazard project. Ridley is bringing his own perspective and skepticism to the way we create narrative meaning in contemporary culture and understands that sometimes a formalism that is larger than life can be essential to telling a historical truth as a more sober and conventional presentation. Gladiator II takes these principles and applies them not only to history, but to the legacy of the original film. While Gladiator was a massive hit, it is in many ways bound to the culture that birthed it. Released in 2000, the film's production predated 9/11, the Patriot Act, the dizzying Bush era. It's a great film, but it's a film of its time. And for Ridley, its enduring popularity, despite feeling somewhat frozen in time, demanded a specific approach to its sequel. For as skeptical as Ridley Scott may be of the way historical knowledge is perverted through an extended game of telephone, Gladiator II continues this thematic exploration, building upon the foundation of the original Gladiator to examine the fragility of truth in history and the storyteller's responsibility in preserving meaning. There's a weighty meta quality to making a sequel to a historical epic 20 plus years later that must meaningfully grapple with its own legacy, and with Gladiator II, he absolutely rises to the challenge. For as much as I love the original Gladiator, and I really love the original Gladiator, like most everyone out there, its position in culture over the years has settled more into historical power fantasy than something at all subversive. With Scott's sequel, he seeks to complicate that spectacle and provide new and contradictory perspectives that must translate a Hollywood classic from Bill Clinton's 90s to Donald Trump's 2020s. The dream of Rome, a central theme in Gladiator, is interpreted differently by every character, reflecting how ideals are co-opted and distorted over time. If history is doomed to fade,
like tears in rain,
then the role of the storyteller becomes paramount. In the original Gladiator, Commodus plays the role of ruler, attempting to shape narrative in the Colosseum to project power and influence. But when Maximus powerfully refuses to bend the knee at his own mortal peril, he refuses Commodus' storytelling and reclaims the truth and values of Rome lost to apathy and changing rule. However, at the start of Gladiator II, we learn that Rome has bounced back to decay and debauchery, forgetting the sacrifices of those who came before. In Gladiator, Maximus fought to preserve the values of his home. In Gladiator II, Lucius understandably turns away. To some, the fundamental unwinding of the first Gladiator's victory is a disappointment and makes the sequel feel redundant, but what they fail to realize is that for Ridley, this reset bears a meta function. If history is rewritten by those in power to establish ideological narratives and values, then why shouldn't Ridley reclaim his classic Gladiator and resituate its themes and struggles within the darker context of today? The wide-eyed optimism of pre-9/11, Gladiator feels flowery by today's standards, and Gladiator II reflects a more contemporary reality, one in which greed reigns supreme and ethics are flexible. This philosophy explains why Scott prioritizes narrative intent over historical precision in his films, which he gets more shit than anyone for whatever reason. I guess because he made Gladiator and that makes him Mr. Historical Epic. I mean, yeah, the guy likes doing historical epics, but like, he's the only filmmaker, or one of the only few filmmakers that is really held to that standard and really scrutinized for how he's, takes creative liberties with historical details. People get caught up about, like, why are they flooding the Colosseum? That never happened. And then we found out it did. So it's really, really silly to nitpick historical inaccuracies when it comes to Ridley Scott. His focus is not on rigidly adhering to the details of history, but on ensuring that the underlying themes resonate with contemporary audiences while meaningfully contextualizing his work within the work that has come before. The original Gladiator left viewers with the impression that Maximus had restored justice by killing Commodus, fulfilling Marcus Aurelius' dream of a Rome ruled by the people. However, Gladiator II challenges this assumption, illustrating how history is rewritten by those in power. We quickly learn that Maximus's legacy has been erased, his name stricken from the record, and Commodus's rule is enshrined in official history. Those who witnessed Maximus's heroism know the truth, but the masses accept the version presented by the Empire, which we see most notably in Macrinus, played by a gleeful Denzel Washington. Macrinus used to be a slave, but now pursues power in Rome through the sort of conniving valued by his debauched society. The only history he knows is the one set forth by those in power, one of cruelty and change by violent force. For this reason, he sees no value in democracy and can't be a force for positive change. He comes from a world that values retribution over reform. And if vengeance is our only mode, we can only perpetuate violence. We can't change it. The most common critique of Gladiator II is that it is, in many ways, a retread of the original. But to dismiss it out of hand is to miss the essential thematic ideas it explores. Like with most stories, when the original Gladiator ended, there was a sense of finality and accomplishment, that Maximus killed the emperor and therefore was able to enact the dream of Marcus Aurelius. But we know people, and we know that there are no easy solutions to complex problems. And so the pragmatist, the cynic in Scott knew that when approaching a sequel, treating the first film as a story whose truth was lost to time and narratively co-opted by the Roman government to maintain control was the appropriate direction. Because that's what history's taught us, that it doesn't really matter what's happened in the past. There are plenty of instances where iconography, which originally held one meaning, was co-opted by nefarious forces in order to gather people to their cause because they had an idea of what that iconography meant in the past. We see Paul Mescal's Lucius on a similar narrative trajectory because the system is in place to oppress and stifle revolutionaries like Maximus or Lucius. Those in power know that when enough time passes, history will be forgotten and recontextualized by the ruling class. With Gladiator II, Ridley Scott seizes power and reshapes the past. With the original Gladiator, Scott imagined a better world, a triumph over tyranny. With Gladiator II, he becomes a sort of Macrinus, accepting the reality of a world in moral decline. Where most filmmakers would build on their original work, Scott aims to supplant his with a more apt and contemporary vision. A key aspect of Gladiator II is its meditation on the cyclical nature of history. The film emphasizes humanity's failure to learn from the past, perpetuating the same mistakes under different guises. Rome remains stagnant, caught in an endless loop of conquest, oppression, and internal decay. This thematic concern aligns closely with Scott's work in science fiction, particularly the relationship between Alien and Prometheus. Just as Gladiator II reframes the events of Gladiator, Prometheus recontextualizes Alien, examining the origins of the very forces that shaped the first film's narrative. Both sequels challenge the assumptions established in their predecessors, forcing audiences to reconsider what they once accepted as truth. Prometheus asks, where do monsters come from? Gladiator II asks, who decides what history remembers? It's especially profound when you take into consideration that the iconic slogan associated with Gladiator and Gladiator II is, "What we do in life echoes in eternity." This feels like something maybe Scott perhaps believed earlier in 2000 when the original Gladiator released. With Gladiator II, he's not so certain. He's also aware of the fact that yes, what we do in life, if it is truly great, if it truly enacts change and inspires people, may echo in eternity, but the cynic in him, which I find to be the side of him that often drives his most interesting work, understands that the truth of history, the truth of those actions that have echoed throughout eternity, can be manipulated, can be co-opted, can be twisted in order to suit whatever agenda people in positions of power have. So even if these great actions echo in eternity, there's no guarantee that the intended purpose, the truth, will remain intact. Scott demonstrates a fascination with the way his own work, like history, evolves over time. Just as Rome rewrites its past, recounting its war crimes as war triumphs in the Colosseum, so too does Scott revisit his films, interrogating their meanings and reframing them through a contemporary lens. Facts are merely one aspect of history, a very important aspect, because without the facts, what does it all matter? And we've seen how people manipulate the facts, but they're also not the whole story. Scott, better than anyone, understands that we narrativize our own past for a reason. While it is perhaps not the whole truth, it is the truth that we need to convey. We can't simply look back at history as a bunch of text on a page or just these vague abstractions or ideas of things that happened. We need to get to the heart of these things. We can compile the facts, pore over them, have a better understanding of history that way, but at the end of the day, we can't be Rome 2.0, perpetuating the same stories in the Colosseum. Prometheus strips away the simplicity of aliens' horror and replaces it with existential dread. Much like Gladiator II, deconstructs the triumph of Gladiator by exposing the illusion of victory. In both cases, Scott suggests that stories, like history, are subject to reinterpretation, and that reinterpretation is the only way to truly understand their significance. Ultimately, Gladiator II serves as a powerful reminder that history's meaning is never fixed. It is the responsibility of storytellers to preserve their version of truth, to ensure that lessons from the past are not lost to spectacle. And if we need to reshape them by force, so be it.